Have you ever heard of a war where trained soldiers armed with powerful machine guns went head-to-head, not with another country, not with rebels, but with birds? It sounds like a joke, something straight out of a comedy sketch, but this actually happened. And what makes it even more unbelievable is this: the army didn't win. They didn't even come close. Instead, they walked away embarrassed, defeated, and completely outsmarted by a group of flightless birds called emus. This is the story of how an entire military operation turned into one of the strangest defeats in history. A story filled with desperation, pride, chaos, and a twist no one saw coming. Because what started as a simple solution to a farming problem slowly turned into a full-blown battle that would leave an entire nation shaking its head in disbelief. But to really understand how things got this out of control, we need to go back to the beginning, back to a time when the world was already struggling. The year was the early 1930s. The world was still trying to recover from the devastating effects of World War I. Economies were collapsing, jobs were disappearing, and people everywhere were struggling just to survive. This period became known as the Great Depression, and it didn't spare Australia. Farmers in Australia were among the hardest hit. Crops weren't selling, prices were dropping, and many families were on the edge of losing everything. The government knew something had to be done, so they came up with a plan. They encouraged farmers to grow wheat. The idea was simple: increase production, stabilize the market, and support struggling farmers by buying their crops at fair prices. It sounded like a lifeline, and many farmers trusted the government. They worked tirelessly, planting and tending to vast fields of wheat, hoping that this would be their way out of hardship. Months passed, the crops grew, and finally the fields were ready for harvest. But then, everything changed. The government didn't keep its promise. Instead of paying good prices, they offered much lower rates. Farmers felt betrayed. After all the hard work, after all the hope they had placed in this plan, they were left with crops they couldn't sell for a fair price. Many of them made a bold decision. They refused to harvest their wheat. It was a protest, a way of pushing back against what they saw as a broken promise. But what they didn't realize was that leaving those crops standing in the fields would invite a problem far worse than low prices, because something else was on the move. Something that would turn this entire situation upside down. Every year, after their breeding season, emus, large flightless birds native to Australia, would migrate in search of food and water. Normally, this wasn't a major issue, but this time, things were different. As thousands of emus began their migration, they came across something they couldn't resist: endless fields of wheat. To them, it was like finding a buffet in the middle of nowhere, fresh, abundant, and completely unprotected. Within days, massive groups of emus flooded the farmlands, and they didn't just eat a little, they devoured everything in sight. Imagine waking up one morning to find your fields, your only source of income, completely destroyed. That's exactly what happened. Farmers watched helplessly as thousands of emus trampled crops, broke fences, and wiped out entire sections of farmland overnight. And it didn't stop there. The damage spread rapidly. What started as a few flocks turned into an overwhelming invasion. Some estimates suggested there were over 20,000 emus moving through the region. Farmers tried everything they could to scare them away. They chased them, shouted at them, even threw objects, but nothing worked. The birds were fast, strong, and surprisingly stubborn. Days turned into weeks. The losses kept growing. And that's when the farmers decided they had no choice left. They went to the government and asked for help. Now here's where things take a turn no one expected. Instead of coming up with a simple agricultural solution, the government made a shocking decision. They called in the military. Yes, the army. At first, it might sound extreme, but in their minds, it made sense. These were trained soldiers who had just come out of a global war. They had weapons, discipline, and experience. Compared to human enemies, how hard could it be to deal with a bunch of birds? Or at least that's what they thought. The plan was straightforward. Send a small group of soldiers equipped with machine guns into the affected areas. Locate the emu flocks, open fire, eliminate the threat. Quick, efficient, problem solved. But here's the twist. Nothing went to plan. The soldiers arrived, confident and ready. They set up their positions and waited for the emus to come into range. And when they finally did, the order was given. Fire. Bullets tore through the air. The sound echoed across the fields. But instead of dropping in large numbers, the emus did something completely unexpected. They scattered, not in panic, but in strategy. Instead of moving as one large group, they broke into smaller units, running in different directions at incredible speeds. It became almost impossible to track them, let alone hit them. And just like that, the first attack failed.
Only a handful of emus were taken down. The soldiers were confused. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They regrouped and decided to try a different approach. This time, they would wait. They hid near water sources, knowing the birds would eventually come to drink. The idea was to catch them off guard when they gathered in one place. And for a moment, it seemed like it might work. A large group of emus approached the area. The soldiers held their breath, waiting for the perfect moment. Then, they opened fire again. But fate had other plans. Just as the shooting began, the machine gun jammed. In the chaos of trying to fix it, the emus once again scattered and disappeared into the landscape. Another failure. At this point, frustration started to build. These weren't ordinary birds. They were fast, unpredictable, and surprisingly resilient. It was almost as if they were learning, adapting to the attacks. But the soldiers weren't ready to give up. They came up with a new strategy. If they couldn't hit the emus from a fixed position, they would chase them. They mounted a machine gun on a vehicle, planning to drive through the fields and fire at the moving flocks. It sounded like a clever idea, mobile, aggressive, and fast. But reality hit hard. The terrain was rough, uneven, and difficult to navigate. The vehicle bounced violently as it moved, making it nearly impossible to aim accurately. Bullets were fired, but most missed their targets. And then, disaster struck. At one point, the vehicle lost control and crashed. The operation had turned into chaos. Thousands of rounds had been fired, yet the number of emus killed was shockingly low. The birds continued to roam freely, destroying crops as if nothing had happened. And what made it even more unbelievable was this. The emus seemed to have leaders. Soldiers noticed that within each group there were certain birds that stayed alert while others fed. These leaders would watch for danger, and the moment they sensed something unusual, they would signal the rest to flee. It was organized, coordinated, almost tactical. The longer the operation went on, the clearer it became. This wasn't a simple mission anymore. It was a losing battle. Eventually, the situation reached a breaking point. Reports were sent back to officials detailing the failures, the wasted ammunition, and the ongoing destruction. And when this story reached the public, it became a national embarrassment. People couldn't believe what they were hearing. A modern army, equipped with advanced weapons, had been outmaneuvered by birds? The media began to mock the operation, turning it into a symbol of poor planning and overconfidence. Under pressure, the government made a decision. They called off the operation. The war was over, and the emus had won. Think about that for a second. An entire military effort, launched with confidence and authority, had been defeated by creatures that couldn't even fly. But the story doesn't end there, because while the soldiers left the battlefield, the problem didn't disappear.
The emus were still there, the farms were still vulnerable, and the damage continued. So the government had to come up with a new plan. This time, they took a different approach. Instead of sending in the military, they gave farmers weapons and introduced a bounty system. For every emu killed, there would be a reward. It turned into a large-scale effort, with locals taking matters into their own hands. And slowly, it started to work. Over time, the number of emus in the affected areas was reduced, and farmers were able to regain some control over their land. But even then, the memory of what had happened didn't fade. Because this wasn't just about birds. It was about pride, about underestimating a problem, about thinking that strength alone is enough to win any battle. The emotional impact of this strange war went deeper than people expected. For the soldiers, it was humiliating. These were men who had faced real enemies, survived brutal conflicts, and carried the weight of war on their shoulders. And yet here they were, being laughed at for losing to birds. For the farmers, it was a painful reminder of how quickly things can fall apart. First, they were let down by broken promises. Then their livelihoods were destroyed by forces they couldn't control. Even the solution that was supposed to save them turned into a failure. And for the government, it was a lesson they couldn't ignore. Because sometimes the biggest mistakes don't come from lack of power. They come from lack of understanding. In the end, this bizarre chapter in history became known as one of the strangest wars ever fought. Not because of how it started, but because of how it ended. With confusion, with embarrassment, and with a victory that no one ever expected. So the next time you hear someone say that humans always find a way to win, remember this story. Remember the time when strategy failed, when confidence turned into chaos, and a group of determined birds stood their ground against an entire army. Because history isn't always about the strongest side winning. Sometimes it's about the side that refuses to lose. And in this case, that side had feathers.